The Spencers were purely British. That was the story. 5 centuries of English nobility, the grand rooms of Althorp House, an unbroken line of earls and courtiers stretching back to men who served Henry VIII. That was the framework inside which every biography of Diana Frances Spencer began. It was the foundation of everything the world thought it understood about the woman who would become the most photographed human being of the 20th century. And then, in June of 2013, a small Scottish genetics company published a press release that rewrote that foundation without raising its voice. It began not with a revelation, but with a letter. A fragment of correspondence written in broken English and signed in Armenian script with 2 words, Sahiba Forbes. The letter was dictated by a woman named Eliza Kewark, born around 1790 in the port city of Surat on the western coast of India. It was addressed to a Scottish merchant who had already sailed away from her. She would never see him again. What those letters eventually proved, not through sentiment but through mitochondrial science, is the subject of this film. There is a living family at the center of this story. Princes William and Harry carry the inheritance we are about to discuss. This is not a film about scandal. It is a film about a woman who was erased, a family that needed her gone, and a strand of DNA so rare it had only been recorded 14 times in all of human population history. Hold that number, 14. We will come back to it. Stay with this. What the record shows is worth the time. The story the world received was this. Diana Frances Spencer was born on the 1st of July 1961 at Park House on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, the 4th child of John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, and his wife, Frances Ruth Roche. Her father's family, the Spencers, had been among the premier aristocratic houses of England since the 15th century. They had served as courtiers, military officers, and political figures across 500 years. They had sat beside kings. They had lived at Althorp, a country estate in Northamptonshire that housed one of the most significant private art collections in Britain. Her mother's family, the Roches, later the Barons Fermoy, carried their own credentials. Frances's father was Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy, and her mother Ruth was a confidant and lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The 2 families were not merely socially proximate to the House of Windsor. They were woven into its immediate domestic life. When Diana married the Prince of Wales on the 29th of July, 1981, the world understood this as an essentially English arrangement, an English prince, an English aristocrat, a lineage that was, on both sides, thoroughly and documentably European. That understanding was not wrong, precisely. It was simply incomplete. The first crack appeared not in a laboratory but in a library. In the Special Collections Archive of King's College Library at Aberdeen University, in a manuscript folder catalogued as Manuscript 2740, a researcher named Susan Harvard found the unsorted personal papers of a Scottish family, papers that had sat undisturbed for the better part of 2 centuries. Among them were Theodore Forbes's letter books, and in those letter books were her letters. They were dictated to a Parsi scribe. They were signed in Armenian script, and they described in careful and affectionate language a woman who called herself and insisted on calling herself Mrs. Forbes, despite the fact that the man she was writing to had already referred to her in his will with devastating brevity as his housekeeper and to their daughter as his reputed natural child. The name on the letters was Eliza Kewark. The year of the earliest surviving letter was 1812. The city was Surat. Something in the genealogy of Princess Diana had been waiting in that folder for 200 years. Dr. Jim Wilson was not looking for Princess Diana. He was a geneticist at the University of Edinburgh, and in the spring of 2012, he had co-founded a company called Britain's DNA with a single operating purpose: to use mitochondrial DNA to map the deep ancestral origins of the British population, not the ancestry of the famous, but the ancestry of the ordinary. The project aimed to reconstruct a people's history from the bottom up, beginning with the genetic signatures that mothers pass intact to their children, generation after generation, unchanged except by the slow mutations of geological time. He was not researching royalty. He was not seeking headline material. He was building a reference population database. It was in the process of tracing standard genealogical pathways through maternal lineages that his team encountered the line running through Frances Shand Kidd, Diana's mother, and further back through the Roche family, and further still through the Forbes connection in Aberdeenshire, and then over the ocean to Surat in Gujarat, and finally to Eliza Kewark. At that point, the genealogical record became ambiguous. Family documents described Eliza as Armenian. Her surname, Kewark, has an Armenian linguistic register. Letters from her brother-in-law, a man named Aga Aratun Baldassier, were written in Armenian script. The Scottish relatives who received Catherine Forbes, Eliza's daughter, who arrived in Aberdeen as an orphan child after her father died at sea, introduced her to local society as the daughter of an Armenian woman. Armenia was not only more socially acceptable in early Victorian Scotland than India was. Armenia was, as one contemporary analysis noted, home to the world's oldest Christian community. It was a useful origin. But mitochondrial DNA does not negotiate with social convenience. Wilson's team identified 2 living women who stood as direct matrilineal descendants of Eliza Kewark, third cousins of Frances Shand Kidd, Diana's mother. They were tested with saliva samples. Their mitochondrial sequences were read and cross-referenced against a reference database of more than 65,000 individuals from populations across the world. The result placed both women, and by direct inheritance Diana herself, in mitochondrial haplogroup R30b. Of 65,000 samples, only 14 individuals in the entire database carried this haplogroup. 13 were from India. 1 was from Nepal. Not 1 was from Armenia. The Armenian story had held for nearly 200 years. The DNA ended it in a single afternoon. Before proceeding further, it is worth pausing on the strongest version of the counter-argument. It deserves full consideration. The objection runs as follows. Mitochondrial DNA traces only the direct maternal line, mother to mother to mother, one unbroken thread through a web of hundreds of ancestors. At 8 generations of distance, Eliza Kewark represents only a fractional component of Diana's total genetic inheritance. The haplogroup R30b result establishes Eliza's maternal ancestry as Indian, but it does not, strictly speaking, tell us the full composition of Eliza herself. Her father, family records suggest, may well have been Armenian. She may have been genuinely mixed, with a Muslim Indian mother and an Armenian Christian father, which would explain both the Armenian script in her letters and the South Asian classification in her mitochondrial result. The DNA in this reading confirms Indian heritage on one side, but does not necessarily contradict all elements of the family's Armenian account. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed. The research team acknowledged it directly. Dr. Wilson's published response to this counter-argument was methodological and precise. The mitochondrial haplogroup is inherited through the maternal line exclusively, which means it establishes, beyond statistical ambiguity, that Eliza's mother and Eliza's mother's mother, and so on back through the female line, were of South Asian origin. The haplogroup R30b and its related branches, R30a and R30, have been found exclusively among South Asian populations in every comparative database available. The claim that Eliza was Armenian, which the Forbes family used to explain away her origin, referred in all surviving documents to her father's side, not her mother's. The DNA establishes what the family had most carefully concealed. The maternal Indian line was real, continuous, and documentable. The archive layer deepened this further. Susan Harvard's examination of the Aberdeen University manuscript collection revealed something that genetics could not: the texture of the concealment itself. In the Forbes family papers, the word Indian does not appear. The word Armenian appears repeatedly. Eliza's letters, dictated in broken English to a Parsi scribe and signed in Armenian script, were preserved, but the family's subsequent descriptions of her systematically replaced her Indian connection with an Armenian one. The substitution was deliberate, it was social, and it persisted, without challenge, through 6 generations of a family that eventually produced the most famous woman in the world. This is where the 2 tracks meet. The documentary archive and the genetic sequence were pointing, independently, at the same buried truth. Recall the number 14. We said we would return to it. Of the more than 65,000 individuals in the reference database that Dr. Wilson's team consulted, only 14 carried the precise mitochondrial sequence belonging to Eliza Kewark's line. 14. In a database built to represent the broad genetic diversity of humanity. Of those 14, every single one was from South Asia, 13 from India, 1 from Nepal, none from Armenia, none from Britain, none from anywhere in Europe. The rarity of R30b is not merely a statistical curiosity. It is the mechanism by which the science becomes conclusive rather than suggestive. A common haplogroup, one found in hundreds of populations across multiple continents, would have left the door open to alternative interpretations. But a haplogroup this rare, concentrated this specifically in South Asian populations, with 0 representation in Armenian or European databases, removes the interpretive space. The family's preferred narrative required Eliza to be Armenian. The most specific genetic test available placed her, with exceptional precision, in Western India. The convergence, when it arrived, came from 2 directions that had never communicated with each other. The genealogical work, Susan Harvard's excavation of the Aberdeen University papers, the tracing of Kitty Forbes's descendants through 2 centuries of Scottish and English family records, had established the ancestral chain. It had mapped the human root from Surat to Sandringham. The genetic work, Wilson's mitochondrial analysis, the saliva samples from 2 living women who share a bloodline with Diana, had established the biological reality underneath the family's chosen story. Neither team had been looking for this. Both found the same answer. There is one more dimension to this story that almost no account of the discovery has addressed directly. Eliza Kewark's mitochondrial line does not end with Diana. It runs forward through her sons. Princes William and Harry both carry Eliza Kewark's R30b sequence, inherited intact from their mother. They carry it now in every cell of their bodies. It is the most documented and precisely identified piece of South Asian genetics in any living European royal family. It will not, however, pass further. Mitochondrial DNA travels only through daughters. George, Charlotte, and Louis inherited their mitochondria from Catherine, Princess of Wales. Eliza Kewark's line, which survived 200 years of active concealment, has now reached its end in the male line of succession. The concealment was not cruelty for its own sake. It had a structure, and the structure had a name. The early 19th century produced a phenomenon so widespread across British colonial society that historians of the period have given it a precise designation: the country connection. British men employed by the East India Company, merchants, administrators, political agents, regularly formed long-term domestic partnerships with local Indian women. These women kept their houses, raised their children, and in many cases, as the surviving letters of Eliza Kewark demonstrate, loved the men they lived with a fidelity that the formal record refused to acknowledge. Theodore Forbes's own will, the document in which he referred to Eliza as his housekeeper and to their daughter as his reputed natural child, was not unusual. It was the standard legal language of the era. It was the official grammar of erasure. When those merchants died or sailed home, the children of these unions faced a categorization problem. Mixed-race children in early Victorian Britain occupied a social position that was genuinely precarious. The aristocracy was not merely snobbish about continental European lineage. It was, in the specific legal and social architecture of the 1820s and 1830s, deeply hostile to anything it classified as native blood. The children who arrived from India needed an explanation their new communities could accept. Armenian was an explanation. Armenian was Christian. Armenian was European adjacent. Armenian was, in practical social terms, white enough. The Forbes family was not unique in this decision. Genealogists and historians of the colonial period have documented hundreds of cases following this identical structure. Indian mother, Scottish or English father, mixed-race children relocated to Britain, Indian heritage replaced in family records with a more acceptable European identity. The substitution was, in most cases, so thoroughly maintained that it survived not merely through one or two generations, but across the entire subsequent history of the families involved. In the case of Eliza Kewark, the Armenian story held for 6 generations, from the death of Theodore Forbes in 1820 to the DNA publication in 2013. That is 193 years. Today, there are British Indian communities whose members carry surnames and family histories that reflect a colonial ancestry they were never permitted to name. Eliza Kewark was not an exception. She was one woman in a pattern that shaped hundreds of families whose descendants are alive right now, some of whom almost certainly do not know what the archive and the science would show them. It is worth, before the end, saying clearly what this discovery does not change. Diana Spencer's life and work and grief and generosity belonged entirely to her. She walked through landmine fields. She sat with people dying of diseases that other public figures refused to acknowledge. She spoke about her own suffering in public at a time when British public life had no language for that kind of honesty. And in doing so, she gave language to millions of people who had been trying to find it alone. None of that is altered by the genetic record. None of it is diminished by a haplogroup. What she built was hers. What she chose was hers. What the DNA changes is the story told about her origins, and, by extension, the origin story of the institution she married into. The future of the British monarchy carries, at the cellular level, the inheritance of a woman who was described in the legal documents of her own lifetime as a housekeeper. A woman whose Indian identity was buried under a socially convenient European substitution and maintained through 193 years of family silence. A woman whose letters to the man she loved were signed always in her own language, in Armenian script, with the words, "Your affectionate Mrs. Forbes," even though the law would never give her that name. Her letters survived in a folder in Aberdeen. The DNA survived in 2 women living quiet lives somewhere in Britain who did not know, until a genetics company sent them a saliva test kit, that they were among only 14 people on Earth known to carry a specific and ancient South Asian lineage. The folder is still in the archive. Manuscript 2740, the worn pages of Theodore's letter book, the broken English dictated to a Parsi scribe, the signature that refused, even in erasure, to disappear. Eliza Kewark was never permitted to be the mother she was. Her daughter was sent to Scotland without her. Her identity was replaced. Her name was almost lost. But the mitochondria passed exactly as they always do, from mother to daughter, generation to generation, unchanged, undeniable, and patient in a way that no archive and no family silence has ever managed to be. She is still there. She has always been there. The science simply learned, eventually, how to listen.